Hey, what's going on, everybody? We are here to preview the Charleston Classic, a multi-team event. 8 teams in this one. I'm excited about the field. I've seen every team play at least once, except for Nevada. Full disclosure there, but reading up on them and podcast. Shout out to the Nevada Hoops Network there, the Nevada Hoops podcast. Podcasts are great, but right here we've got Zach Joachim, covers VCU for the Richmond-Times Dispatch. You're going to be there in TD Arena to talk about these teams. And look, we're going to kind of work backwards from a Miami perspective in terms of the bracket. And as you can see right here, Miami would not face VCU until that third day. It's a 4-day event, whether they play VCU or not. But I think both teams, and Zach, we're going to get into this. Ideally, both teams are eyeing this championship. And all these teams, I think it could really benefit all these teams for different reasons. 4 new head coaches of the field, a lot of new players. You talk about transfers, a lot of these teams, 10 new guys on a team. So early season here. But Zach, your impressions of VCU coming into the tournament at 4-0. We'll break down the team and kind of what they are, but just overall kind of takeaways with what you've seen here.
I said Nevada earlier this week when I was talking to somebody, and they said that I needed to brush up on that before I got there because the Nevada fans were going to get mad at me if I did that. And yeah, man, for these early season tournaments, just in this day and age of college basketball, it can be hard to get a handle on rosters, right? Because you have so much turnover, so many new players. VCU has returners, though. This is a team with a good bit of cohesion in Ryan Odom's second year. Came over from Utah State last offseason. Really, last offseason is when everything was up in the air for this roster after Mike Rhodes left for Penn State and Ryan Odom came over and you had a bunch of transfers come in. Max Shulga and Sean Bairstow followed him from Utah State. Nobody knew what to expect, and coming into this year, it's settled, right? You have 5 graduate players on this roster, which I think is 8th most in the country. So tons of experience, and especially in the backcourt. So it's backcourt depth that's the strength of this team. Graduate guard Zeb Jackson, who was all A10 preseason defensive team, has not played yet. Got a fractured bone in his left hand. Outside hope, I think, for VCU fans that they see him in Charleston. But it looks like he's not going to be back until early December. But they haven't missed a beat without him, especially defensively. They're 10th in the country right now in adjusted defensive efficiency. They're 4-0. Just had their widest margin of victory of the season with a 26-point win over Loyola Maryland, although they trailed early in that game for, I think, 8 minutes and change, which is the most that they've trailed all season, more than the other 3 games combined. Beat Boston College by 25 points at the Veterans Classic at the Naval Academy. I think that's the most impressive result of the season. And then you had home wins over Bellarmine and Merrimack by wide margins. It's hard for VCU to get tough opponents to come into the Siegel Center. The schedule is not impressive when you look at the teams that they're playing at home in the non-conference this year. And so tournaments like this are so important for VCU, for programs like VCU to try and build an at-large resume. Joe Bamisile has been the leading scorer so far this year. He's had quite the college journey. I think a lot of people know that name at this point because he was kind of one of the poster players when the lawsuit was going on last year. On his 4th school, has gone Virginia Tech to George Washington to Oklahoma and now to VCU. And man, he's found a home at VCU. Really lanky, dynamic scoring guard, can score at all 3 levels. He's led this team in scoring so far this year. But the big name to watch is Max Shulga, who was the first team All A10 last year, is one of the names at the top of the list for A10 Player of the Year this year. Ukrainian guard, came over from Utah State with Ryan Odom. Really savvy, can draw fouls really well. Knockdown shooter from outside, has really stepped up his game in the rebounding and defensive departments this year. And then Philip Russell is another graduate player, came over from UT Arlington, was the WAC 6th man of the year last year. And man, he's been hot early on. He had his worst game of the year the other night, and he got teed up against Loyola Maryland. And that's kind of what you're going to get from Phil Russell. And I say that in a complimentary way because the dude plays with intensity, tenacity. He's kind of an old school VCU guard. He will get under opponent's skin. And so expect to see some jawing, and some trash talking from him. He's brought, I think Joe Bamisile in a press conference the other week said he adds a little spice that we didn't have last year. And I enjoyed that quote. And so the backcourt has been really good for this team. And you have 2 talented freshmen who've got some big playing time early on. Brandon Jennings, who's a Richmond native, really good, long defensive player, can really disrupt things on the perimeter for the other team. And then Terrence Hill, who's a really talented player on the offensive end. Those 2 are the future of VCU, and they both got playing time early on with Zeb Jackson missing time. But the big 3 names are Bamisile, Russell, and Shulga. Those are going to be the guys that lead this team in scoring. Jack Clark had 25 points the other night. That was a season high for him. He's had 4 good games so far. Another journeyman and a graduate player who was at Clemson last year. He's gone LaSalle to NC State to Clemson in his college basketball journey. He played his 115th college basketball game the other night, which is wild to me. At the end of the day, his career is going to span 2018 to 2025. So one of those guys just between the COVID year, a medical red shirt who's been around the block at this point. So this is an experienced team. Clark is a really versatile. He's listed as a forward on VCU's roster, but I've seen some of the game sheets list him as a guard. So he's 6'10". He's a really good rebounder. Like he is a front court piece, but he's going to operate on the perimeter a lot. And then Christian Furman, I think it's the other big name to note here. He's a junior forward for this team. Hasn't really got going offensively this year. Is not a guy that's going to play with his back to the basket and score independently through the post. He's more of an efficient dump off guy that, you're going to play in the pick and roll game, and that's how he's going to get going offensively. He's a great rim protector, though. Was one of the top block guys in the A10 last year. And so he's a great presence down low for them. And those are some of the big names. And then the tertiary pieces, Michael Bell, who's dealing with an elbow injury right now, wore a brace against Loyola Maryland after a fall that he suffered against Merrimack. But it seems like he's healthy. English guy who is a true sophomore and played a lot as a freshman. Really physical. He's a wing, but he's going to play at the 4 for VCU. He put on weight and a little bit of height in the offseason, still growing. So he's a really versatile piece for Ryan Odom. They're going to play some small ball lineups. You'll see a lot of 3 around 2 and 4 around 1 even with 4 guards out there. So it's a team that's been really good defensively. They're 10th in the country right now in adjusted defensive efficiency, but they've been improved offensively from last year. I think they were getting settled into the scheme that Ryan Odom wants to play. And now with all those graduate players, they're comfortable with kind of Shulga at the helm, a guy who's played with Odom for a long time in playing his system. They want to shoot a lot of threes, but they've been able to beat teams in different ways this year. So it's been a great start. I think they're up to, 35th in the country in Ken Palm's adjusted efficiency metric, and they received some top 25 votes this week. So this is a team that was picked to win the A10 with aspirations of making the NCAA tournament.
And that's, and with VCU too, just to add, and one of the reasons why I wanted to bring you on is it's a team that intrigues me quite a bit. And you touched on the AP top 25. They have the most votes, going into it. None of these 8 teams are ranked, but VCU has 17, right there tied for 31st, and Miami has 10. So those are kind of the top 2 names, but certainly Nevada with what they've done this year, but last year making the tournament, they have a really impressive team. I think, and Zach, we touched on it briefly, it feels like a 3-team race between VCU, Miami, and Nevada in terms of who's going to come out 3-0 and win this tournament. And just kind of going through the bracket once again, VCU has the highest Ken Palm ranking at 35, and just kind of going through it, VCU 4-0, Nevada's the 38th, and they're also 4-0, then Miami 46 at 3-0. And then it kind of gets a little kind of bunched up there, kind of going back down to the bracket with Vanderbilt 4-0. They're number 86. FAU's 81. They're 3-2. They're actually favored by Ken Palm to win over Oklahoma State at 3-0, and Oklahoma State's 88. Then Seton Hall 2-2. NIT winners a year ago. We'll get into some matchup stuff that you think about with Seton Hall. They're 97. Then Drake 3-0. They're 125 with the transition period going on there at Drake. It's just a lot of intriguing games. And Coach Larinaga mentioned, when I asked him about this event, he just felt like, and this is so true, I think every coach would say this, just so many different, just the different leagues, so many different playing styles. I think from watching all of these teams play that, you've got height. Sometimes you slow down, you go real slow and just try to grind it out a super defensive team like Seton Hall, or you crank it up with the tempo. And VCU certainly has been good defensively as well. But just kind of seeing how these teams have played when we were talking, FAU, for example, had this crazy game at Charleston, double overtime, 97 tied up at 97 going into overtime. Just a wild game. Oklahoma State, I saw them play really well as well in a home win there. So a lot of energy and excitement with these teams. And I just think, I think there's a lot of questions that are going to be answered with these teams. As you mentioned, VCU's got a lot of players returning, but I think, you want to see how you stack up against some of these teams. As you mentioned, everybody's kind of fighting for either at-large wins, kind of how things are going to kind of play out as you build your tournament resume early on in the season. Miami played 3 really weak teams to begin the season, overran them. And I think it's going to be a transition a little bit, particularly in that second game for Miami, whoever they face. there. I think it's just going to be a little bit of a transition in terms of facing better competition. With VCU, you mentioned a few things that stood out to me, and I watched that game against Boston College. It's always good to kind of see some ACC teams while doing these kind of things. That game in Annapolis, the 80-55 win. Uh, I want to touch on with Bam Seal and Shulga. Those are kind of the two guys that stood out. And look, if you're looking ahead, I do want to mention this with Russell. You touched on his competitiveness. Look, if we see a Philip Russell and a Jalil Bethia kind of interaction in a game, I know you might not think of it because Jalil's going to be coming off the bench, but he's got that edge too. So
Somebody's
kind of
getting blown up.
well, watch those two if they get on the court together. I think they're going to go at it. But I like what I've seen from Russell, hard nosed point guard there. But Bamasil, look, he's a guy. Years ago, as you mentioned, he was at Virginia Tech. He actually had his best game as a Hokie against Miami that freshman year. So, but the excitement he plays with, the dunks, the highlight reel plays, and just seems to be taking that next step. 19 and a half a game, and then Shulga, just that game last game, it felt not that I kind of was reading and listening and nobody was really worried about Max, but for him to kind of break out coming into the tournament, it seemed like that was a good thing too. But those two guys in particular, what kind of problems do they possess there at 6'4", 6'5"? And this is where I think from a Miami standpoint, I'll talk more about Miami, but the bigger guards, I think all across the tournament, a lot of these teams have bigger guards, and that's something Miami is going to have to deal with.
Max Shulga had to carry a huge weight offensively for this team last year for a lot of the season, and he had a sports hernia that he was dealing with all year that he sustained in VCU's trip to Greece last summer. And so he wasn't healthy for much of the year, and Joe Bamisile wasn't eligible to start the season. Sean Bairstow, who's since graduated, was another big piece for VCU last year, was injured early in the year. So Shulga was kind of the guy that had to create off the dribble and do a lot of things this team out of the flow of the offense. And this year, I think he's been able to settle in. You touched on it. There was some consternation after 3 games in the VCU fan base about what's wrong with Max Shulga. And we all have recency bias because he had a game-high 19 and was 6 of 6 from the floor in their opener against Bellarmine. So he was great offensively in that game, but then a couple of below his standards offensive games against BC and against Merrimack. I think that was more a product of him not having to carry this team, and Philip Russell and Joe Bamisile were both hot in those games. And so, man, his dad was a referee in the Ukraine, and have talked to him a little bit about that. His comes from a basketball family, and I think you see that familiarity with how a ref sees the game when Max plays. He's really good at drawing fouls, really good at body positioning, really good at leverage, really good at creating contact. So you can get to the line quite often. He went through the NBA scouting process this past year too, and I think the feedback that he got from scouts was, we know you can score the ball, we know you can shoot it, and they wanted him to improve in the defensive side of things, and in the rebounding battle, and just in terms of his stamina with being able to run the floor. And so I think those are the things that you've seen him focus on this year. He can still be that leading scorer when this team needs him to be. And he was, again, really good the other night in the win over Loyola Maryland, and got going offensively. And that was great for VCU fans to see him have the offensive game that they know he can have going into this tournament. But he's been really good in all facets of the game this year. And so I think you're seeing a more well-rounded game from him because he wants to go pro. And that was what scouts told him that they needed to see more of from him. And Joe Bamisile, you touched on it, is a really fun player to watch and an awesome human being. I've rarely interviewed people that I've enjoyed talking to more than Joe Bamisile. He'll just give you really fun, charismatic breakdowns of action in the game. He's really funny at press conferences. A guy who is an entrepreneur who started a mental health app in the off season and has been really open about, how his transfer saga has impacted his own mental health over the last few years. And so awesome guy to talk to. He's a Richmond guy from Chesterfield, just outside of Richmond City proper. And so this fan base loves him. And those two guys have very much been the offensive leaders for this team. And they, like I said, they can score at all 3 levels. They can get to the mid-range, although Ryan Odom is a coach that very much wants this team getting to the cup or taking threes. So you're not going to see VCU take a whole lot of mid-range looks. The first game of the year, they were 15 of 29 from 3 against Bellarmine. So if they can get going from outside, this is a team that can light it up. But then you had games like Merrimack, who runs that chaos zone where they want to run you off the 3-point line, and the wings and guards are extended kind of with their heels on the 3-point line. And VCU was able to penetrate and was great in the paint that game and did score in the mid-range. And so I think this is a team that has proven early on that they can beat you in multiple ways offensively with those two guys at the forefront. You can have different pieces step up, right? Philip Russell had a great start to the year, and then he was off the other night against Loyola Maryland, and other guys stepped up. We talked about Jack Clark a little bit. He had a game high 25 in that win over Loyola Maryland. And so different pieces have stepped up at different times for this team, but it's definitely going to be, they're going to go as Joe Bamistile and Max Shulga go, especially while Zeb Jackson is still out. And I think there's an outside chance that we see him in Charleston, but it's not likely. And I like what you talked about with different styles in this tournament, because VCU has early on kind of seen some really different looks, right? Bellarmine, which runs this kind of fascinating, they minimize dribbling. They really swing the ball around from side to side offensively. And then Merrimack, which has sort of a fascinating defensive scheme with that extended zone that they call a chaos zone. That was fun to watch. And look, BC is going to finish toward the bottom of the ACC, I think. And so VCU fans were trying not to get too excited about that result. But look, that, to beat an ACC team by 25 on a neutral floor early on for a program like VCU was huge. And you know what this team struggled with last year that I'll be fascinated to see in this tournament is how they defend true post players. 7-footers that want to play with their back to the basket and score in the post, because that was a liability for them last year. And they want to play a lot of small ball. So you're going to see a lot of 4-around-1, 3-around-2 lineups from this team, with Jack Clark and Michael Bell out there. Christian Furman is a good post defender, but he's kind of your only experienced true big who can guard in the post. Chad Venning for Boston College gave VCU fits last year when he was at St. Bonaventure. And against BC, they doubled aggressively to get the ball out of his hands. They made him catch far out, and he was never really able to get going in that game. And so I think that's definitely something to look for if VCU faces in these 3 games in Charleston here, a true post player and a team that wants to play through the post. How they defend that, it seems like they've got a plan going into this year. Man, against Seton Hall, I expect a bit of a defensive slog, right? Because I think they're 9th in the country in adjusted defensive efficiency. VCU is 10th. And Shaheen Holloway is a great coach. I know they're always tough and hard-nosed. And so I expect that to be a defensive game. I was looking at Seton Hall's results early on. I don't think they've scored more than 60 so far this year. They held Wagner to, 28 the other night. And so phenomenal defensive team. And honestly, from a VCU fan perspective, that's, they're excited that you've got a fresh offensive mind and a Ryan Odom and a coach, Ryan Odom, who doesn't come from the Shaka Smart coaching tree, because for a long time you had Will Wade, you had Mike Rhodes, guys who were on that Final Four staff from 2011. Ryan Odom is a departure from that. And so I think it's been refreshing in these last couple of years to see more of a refined, modern offensive approach led by guys like Shulga and Banasteel. But at the end of the day, this is still a program, I think, that thinks of its identity in terms of defense. And so for them to be 10th in the country right now, it's not havoc, as you'd expect from VCU in years past, and that trademark defensive scheme where they were picking up full court all the time. They were forcing a lot of live ball turnovers. It's not that. It's certainly more of a half court defensive team, but they're picking up more full court. And I think the backcourt depth is a big part of that. And so you're going to see a little more defensive pressure from this team in Charleston than you did last year. And it's kind of a hybrid defensive scheme, but it's more of a half court team. And they've been good on both ends of the floor. I think they're 66th in the country right now in offensive efficiency. So with Shulga and Banasteel at the 4, if they can get going from outside, there's certainly a high offensive ceiling for this team. I'm excited for the Seton Hall matchup, even though it might not exactly be 97-97 double overtime like that FAU game you were talking about. But I think that VCU fans will appreciate the defense on both sides in that game.
Yeah, I can't see VCU losing that game just watching Seton Hall offensively. And I understand they're playing tough. I just think they're working through some things right now offensively. And, you touched on VCU and you're talking about defensively, just watching them in games, picking up 94 feet at times, and really putting pressure on the ball. And just listen to Ryan Odom, defensive rebounding is big because they want to push it. That'll be something to watch for, also when watching VCU. And look, I want to talk a little bit about the rest of the bracket. Again, I think VCU is going to be fine in that first game. As you mentioned, it could be a little tough, sledding a little bit. They will slow it down. Seton Hall will want to slow it down based on their tempo numbers there. But I just think VCU, with what they're bringing offensively, is going to be too much. And, one guy we didn't touch on, Jack Clark, he was a guy that I've seen quite a bit in the ACC. He was a guy a couple of years ago at NC State. I thought when he wasn't out there, really impacted their team. He's a guy I've liked there. And as you mentioned, he's had some big games. So VCU is an intriguing team, and I think sometimes with college basketball fans maybe don't start paying attention to the mid majors until the end of the year. And this is an opportunity for a lot of college basketball fans to see what this team is about with VCU, but also Nevada. And look, I think they could have. You're talking about some of the best players in this field in this tournament. But with what they have with their top two guys, Kobe Sanders is going to be really impressive to watch. I think everybody's going to come out of this tournament, whoever they're facing, be like, what in the world? Why is this guy kind of here? His skill set at the height he has playing that point, and with Davidson as well, they've got two highly regarded guys. I think they've got a really impressive team there at Nevada, and they face Vanderbilt, and Vanderbilt, coming off that bad year a year ago, 9 wins, but watching them, I was impressed with them, watching them against Cal. And I think Vanderbilt's a perfect example of get a lot of transfers in and then kind of see how it all fits. And again, they've got some guys from the ACC, McLaughlin, notably that have played in the ACC. So Miami fans and ACC fans are familiar with them. And I'm very intrigued by that game. And I know Vanderbilt's only 86 in the Ken Palm, but kind of just seeing their pieces, it just seems like a really intriguing game. But I think the full slate of games is going to be intriguing. I think Miami's going to be fine against Drake. A lot of Division II transfers there with Ben McCollum. I just don't think that they're going to be able to keep up with Miami's speed, athleticism combination. I think Miami's going to be able to get a double-digit win there and kind of really pull ahead, even though Drake will be Miami's best opponent they face this year. But that Oklahoma State FAU game, another really intriguing game. What are any notes you want to add, Zach, on kind of the field here? Again, I've had a chance to watch these teams, and again, I think just a lot of these teams are just really hoping to build their NCAA tournament resume. And I think whoever goes 3-0, I think some 2-1s you can feel good about, depending on what that loss looks like. But I think you can come out of there feeling good. But if you're kind of that 1-2, 0-3 range, you're going to come away disappointed here.
I was impressed with Vandy's metrics too after the year that they had last year, to see that they were in the 80s for Ken Palm. So that's certainly not a gimme in the first round for Nevada, right? And look, Seton Hall has struggled a little bit. They lost to Fordham. Looking around at A10 results, that was a good result for the conference, but that's certainly not a gimme in that first game for VCU, right? Because Seton Hall is tough, and like you said, won the NIT last year. We all know Shaheen Holloway is a great coach. But for VCU, ideally, it's you beat Seton Hall, you get Nevada in the second game, and then Miami in a potential championship game, right? And I think for VCU fans, this tournament is such a huge opportunity, and for the program too, because like we touched on, it's so hard to get good opponents to come into the Siegel Center. In the non-conference, they play Colorado State and New Mexico later on, and those are two big opportunities for them as well. Colorado State's in Vegas on a neutral floor, and then they go to the Pit to play New Mexico. But this is so much of your non-conference resume rests on a tournament like this, right? And getting good results in Charleston. And so after this 4-0 start, I think VCU's up to I saw mid-major rankings throughout the country, and I think they were up to number 2 in the one that I saw earlier this week. And so VCU hopes that this is the opportunity to announce themselves on the national stage, right? As a team that legitimately should be in the top 25 discussion. You touched on it. They got 17 votes this week. VCU hadn't been ranked in a few years. And so I think VCU fans are hoping to come out with 2 or 3 wins here and very much stay in that conversation. And if you can win the tournament, maybe they're ranked on Monday, And another name I wanted to throw into is Brandon Jennings for VCU, who's a freshman who's gotten some good playing time in Zeb Jackson's absence. He's been really good defensively for this team. And I think he's been a big part of their ability to pick up full court and play the defensive pressure that they have, because he has been very ready to contribute, has played like in the 22, 25 minutes in the last couple of contests. He has really earned Ryan Odom's trust out the gates here. Just a kid that does a little bit of everything intangibly on the court. Like even if it's not showing up in the stat sheet, there was a sequence the other day against Loyola Maryland where he missed an open 3 from the corner. It hasn't really totally got going offensively yet. I think you still see some of the freshman jitters for him on that end of the floor, but missed the 3 and just sprinted back to be able to cover in transition and ended up forcing a turnover with a deflection on the baseline. And the crowd got really into that and applauded him for that play. So you see a lot of hustle plays for him, and he's kind of the guy that has filled that Zeb Jackson role defensively. So if VCU is playing a guard that gets going, then I think you'll see Brandon Jennings enter early and pick up that matchup and try and be a bit of the defensive stopper for this team, because he's really been able to contribute early on. And can Jack Clark carry over that offensive momentum? He's not a volume scorer, but man, he's a good shooter. And 9 of 11 from the floor the other night, 25 points against Loyola Maryland. So if he's doing that and they're getting that kind of contribution from him as a front court piece with the backcourt scoring that this team has between Shulga and Banasile and Russell, then they certainly have a high offensive ceiling. And yeah, man, I think VCU fans are kind of chomping at the bit, right, for this opportunity for them to be on national TV and show the country the potential that this team has, because they feel like they have a chance to win the A10 and get a decent seed in the NCAA tournament this year.
Yeah, you mentioned Jenny, and as you mentioned, the scoring's not there, but certainly a freshman to watch in this tournament. I was impressed. We had that 9 rebound game, and I just hear that, I see that, watch it, and then kind of apply it from Miami. And Coach Larinaga wants his freshman, in particular with Jaleel Bethia there, the 5-star freshman, to rebound more. Athletic guy, highlight reel offensive player. He's going to be a lot of fun. I'm really excited to see him, even though he's in a reserve role, to see how he kind of fares here. And look, there's other freshmen. I was impressed with Vanderbilt. Like if Miami faces either VCU or if they happen to face Vanderbilt too, with Trent Tanner there. Tyler Tanner, apologized, but he had a really impressive game against Cal. He's just another freshman guard, kind of in the similar mold as Jaleel and Brandon in terms of size. Just be something to watch for with these kind of tournaments. Look, just kind of wrapping this up here. Miami, I think too, for this tournament, it's a little bit different. They're not necessarily trying to build the non-conference resume, so to speak, although I think Miami, with that, they do need to in terms of trying to be a tournament team, get back to the tournament. But I think this tournament's really big for Miami in terms of better competition as they get ready to face those better teams with Arkansas and Tennessee coming up, and Clemson as well, kind of in this 3-game stretch in December. But in particular, with Arkansas and Tennessee, I just kind of get ready, because after this, I got Charleston Southern, another team Miami should blow out, and just not the level of competition that these other teams are. So it'll be good for Miami to face a better competition. They're still trying to get some lineup stuff figured out. I think there's some matchup things, in particular, as I mentioned, with that the bigger guards, and some of these teams are big. We touched on Nevada, their size, and I think sometimes when you think of maybe a mid-major, not the big size teams that maybe some of the Power 4 conferences, VCU, they're going 6'4", 6'5" with Banasile and Shulga, and then Clark and Fermin, at 6'10", with their size, they have it too, even though, as you mentioned, maybe not the depth. So I'm looking forward to the tournament. For more VIP information, I'm gonna have an article, a breakdown of all these teams. I'm gonna talk about maybe some of their tendencies, and talk about what they're running on offense and defense, kind of their philosophies. But yeah, definitely pay attention. Oklahoma State FAU could be a barn burner there in that first one. A high level, a lot of high energy. They both those teams I expect to get up and run and have a good game. Zach, enjoy the tournament. I appreciate you jumping on here. VCU, a lot of knowledge. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Chris, thank you so much for having me on, man. Appreciate you.